and even situations that seem to be foreign and make no sense. God can use unbelievers to accomplish His will. We saw that when we studied the judgments of God a couple of years ago. We were still at the American Legion building. How God used the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar, certainly no faithful Jew, to execute Jews and bring judgment on Jews. God can do what God will do. He is God. But in this case, it was His will for the Jews to survive. And why is that? Why did God want the Jews to continue to survive? It's pretty simple, really. Plan of salvation. His plan of redemption runs through the Jews. It goes right through the Jewish people, through generations. You can read the generations in the Old Testament. You can read them in Matthew's Gospel. The plan of salvation goes through the Jews. If the Jews are annihilated, there is no plan of salvation. It is gone. And what does that ultimately mean? Everyone is doomed to hell. There is no hope of eternity in heaven. And I'm sure Esther certainly didn't understand that. All she understood was that her people were going to perish. And again, why are the Jews so hated? And we are seeing a rise today in anti-Semitic beliefs. AIPAC is meeting starting today in Washington, D.C., and that is an association affiliated with supporting Israel. Democratic candidates for the presidency have been advised not to go to AIPAC for fear of the message that is going to send to other Democrats. So there are certain prominent Democrats who aren't going because it will rile the base. And what does that think about the base of the Democratic Party? They're anti-Semitic. How they stood up and supported a woman in Congress who said some very nasty things about Israel. Anti-Semitism, hatred against the Jewish people, is nothing new. It has been going on for centuries. And it certainly existed at the time of Esther. Gather all of the Jews together for prayer and fasting 3 days and 3 nights, and then I will go to the king. King Xerxes asked Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" And you can probably see Haman. His arrogance is suddenly gone. What was so proud of what he was about to accomplish was gone, because the king became furious. Yes, Vince?
I just wonder if we could just for a minute or two, discuss that connection, prayer and fasting. Why not just prayer? What was it about the fasting?
Because it is a sacrifice. Most people love to eat. It is something that is highly pleasurable. And there are many different ways of fasting. But to give up something that you desire and gives you great pleasure, to sacrifice that, and instead of doing that thing, to use that time to come before God, makes a very powerful statement to God about how serious you are to see Him move in a certain situation. That you are willing to make a sacrifice of going without. And certainly there are people who should not do a full fast, who have medical conditions where you need to eat, but there are other ways of fasting. Of course, at the time of the queen, the time of the book of Esther, it was abstaining from the eating of food. But you can fast in many different ways. You can fast by giving up, say, the internet for a couple of days. And that time you would spend trolling on the internet, spend that time in calling on God. If you're in a situation where you must eat, you take medications, you need to have medications with food. And I would certainly never tell anyone to jeopardize their health for prayer and fasting. But there are other things that we can do to demonstrate to God how serious we are. But we must be very careful. You cannot manipulate God to do something that you want that may not necessarily be His will. And sometimes you fall into that trap. Well, if I do this, then God's going to give me what I want. Well, what you want may not be part of God's will for you, and even though you're fasting, you may not get it. That was not the case here. The case here was the salvation, the saving of an entire group of people. And that is something that God was certainly desirous to do. And so Haman, when it is exposed after 3 days of banqueting with the king and with the queen, is absolutely struck. I mean, he's fearful. He's begging. He's begging. In fact, the king goes out in anger. He is absolutely furious. And what does Haman do? Esther retires to her room. He goes into her bedroom and starts begging her. When the king comes back, Haman is in Esther's bedroom. You think the king was already mad? Yeah. That sealed it, man. You're trying to take advantage of my wife to persuade her to change my mind. He's done. And we need to understand the absolute authority that a king had in those days. And there are very few in modern society that have a similar kind of power. There are some. Who are those who have a similar kind of power? In a court of law, a judge has tremendous power. If somebody's in the courtroom and they're disobeying, doing something to judge can have them put in handcuffs and locked up. The judge has that right. In that courtroom, that judge is absolutely sovereign over all that takes place. The judge determines the sentence of the people. In many cases, without a jury, the guilt or innocence. But in general society, there aren't many with that kind of power. There are dictators. But that's certainly not true in our country, even though there would be some to lead you to believe that our president is a dictator. Where'd that come from? I think I know where it came from, the pits of hell. And so, the king is at... You like that one? Where'd that come from? The pits of hell.
I'm going to use it sometime.
King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he set up. He is dead. He is gone. Come against Israel and see what God won't do. He may let you go for a while, but we've gone through history. Where are the Assyrians today? Where are the Philistines? Where are the Babylonians? Where are the Nazis? They're all gone out of existence. They all did the same thing. They came against the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. Of course, for the Nazis, it wasn't the nation, because there was no nation. The Jews were all over the world. There was no land of their own. That came in after the war ended. Thanks to our president, Harry Truman, who, by the way, was a Baptist. It was the Baptists that brought the Israelis back to their homeland. And he took a real beating over that. Harry Truman took a beating. He took a beating from the Congress. He took a beating from other foreign leaders. But he was convinced it was the right thing to do, and it certainly was the right thing to do. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, of gladness and honor. In every province and every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with fasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. God's hand moves. God's hand still moves in response to faith, in response to our trusting in Him, and that is such a key element, is to trust Him. And for the situation in America today, we need to do what we can to trust God that He's going to work it out. That He will work it out. Because He is an awesome God. He is a mighty God. What we really need today is a move of God's Spirit. We need revival. We haven't seen revival, widespread revival in this country in a long time. We saw it to a certain extent in the 90s with the Promise Keepers movement. We saw it in the 70s, Vince, with the Jesus People movement. You were part of that. Getting all high on Jesus and stuff. I mean, that was a revival, but it was limited. To see a widespread revival, you have to go back 150 years. Back into the middle of the 1800s. And there was a lot of it then.
There was a great outpouring of the Spirit in the 80s.
In the 80s?
Yeah, Jimmy Swaggart was
Oh, yeah.
part of that, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, you had like the Catholic Charismatic Renewal, and even the Baptists had a Charismatic Renewal, and the Lutherans and Presbyterians. I mean, it just went into all the main line. There were priests and nuns that were speaking in tongues.
I think I've told this before, that back in the 80s, I was living in Wilkes-Barre pastoring my first church. My wife had very dear friends who were Catholic, and they got caught up in the charismatic movement of the Catholic Church. And in Wilkes-Barre, there is a Catholic university, King's College. There are a couple of colleges in Wilkes-Barre, and one is King's, the other is Wilkes, that's a more secular. But King's College was having a Catholic charismatic conference. And so my wife's friend invited us to go to the conference, and it was fantastic. I mean, the gymnasium was filled, several thousand people, tremendous singing, tremendous preaching, and there was a priest from East Liverpool, Ohio, who came. And, I mean, I thought I was listening to Jimmy Swaggart or Billy Graham until he started talking about the Blessed Mother. And as soon as he hit the Blessed Mother, I go, okay, I know. He's a priest.
Still good.
But it was great. What I found interesting is that our friends were close to the bishop. They knew him, he knew them. And so they took us in the back to meet the bishop. And the first thing they did was bow down and kiss his ring. Okay. I didn't kiss the bishop's ring. I didn't do that. God can do amazing things. And when you live in lies, the lies will be exposed, and we're seeing that today. We're seeing lies being exposed about our president. I mean, there are people on TV saying that he is an agent of the Russian government, that he is a traitor, that he has committed treason because of the news conference he had in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin. That was treasonous. I mean, just a bunch of lies. And it's dangerous to constantly listen to that and be fed that. I saw the result of being fed that 24/7. And that becomes hatred. And that is a dangerous thing. Yes?
I had to go to the hospital for some tests this week, and in the waiting room, they have the news on, and it's not Fox.
Of course.
And there's like 15 people in there, and they're spewing lies, and I'm like, I can't believe they have this on in here. You know, either have Fox on or don't have anything on.
Put ESPN on.
Yeah, put something else on. But I wrote a letter, because I don't think we need to be exposed to that in a public place.
I don't listen to the news.
Oh, I just get mad.
That's your whole.
And you know, that whole Mueller investigation was based
On
on a
lies.
false dossier
Paid
that
for by.
Hillary Clinton. It was all lies.
I hope the Attorney
Despite
General
that
goes after all
investigation.
those people. This seems to be a pretty straight-shooting guy. I hope he gets into all of that.
But in airports, they do that too.
Yeah. And if you're listening to that constantly,
Listen to it.
Don't listen.
Politics.
Next week we take a turn. We're still doing women of the faith, but we're moving into the New Testament. Next week is Mary Magdalene.
Praise the Lord.
So then we're going to look at some of the women of faith in the New Testament times leading up to the resurrection. But I already looked ahead. Next Sunday is Mary Magdalene. So that's where we go. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here.